I met an Indian man on one occasion a few years ago, and he told me that it was the practice in his part of the world for if someone had died, let's say a grandparent had died, for a glass coffin, refrigerated, to be brought into the house and placed in the hallway where the person who had died would remain for the next few days, and the family went on about their business. And I thought that's pretty interesting. When I expected my mother to die any day, some years ago, I said to the nurse, look, what happens if she were to die during the day and her body would need to be taken from the nursing home rather than at night, which I assumed would be more palatable. And she said, what we do is we will take your mother down through the nursing home and there will be a guard of honour. And I thought, how civilised in a way. By contrast, there's a writer, Raymond Briggs, who wrote a book for children maybe, but certainly for adults, When the Wind Blows. And there was a couple living in England and a nuclear bomb had just been exploded, so they had been advised nearby. And the woman's reaction was, oh, I'll have to go and bring in the washing. John Nettlefold is a medical man. He's spent a career considering people in sometimes extreme situations, and often working in emergency. He's a surgeon and is confronted by situations where life is precarious and the outcome may be not so certain. And also in circumstances too where there's no time to say goodbye, and certainly no time to prepare like we've been thinking about the last half an hour. So he's well qualified to talk about these matters. I met John some 60 years ago at Norwood High School, and I don't remember what we talked about then, but I feel fairly confident that I'll remember after tonight what we talked about. So will you welcome John Nettlefold, please?
Well, thank you, Ashley, for that introduction and that welcome, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me, and Malcolm in particular, for inviting me to give this talk. Malcolm asked me to do this talk on the journey towards the end quite a long time ago. And I suppose one of the questions I had was, why me? And possibly at the end of this talk you may be asking yourself exactly the same question. But I think it probably was at least partly due to the fact that I have been a medical practitioner, and as such I certainly have had experience with death and seeing people on that, towards the end of that journey. But just as an aside, I recall the fact that when my wife and I drive around the countryside, we sometimes come across a small country town that seems to have a disproportionately large cemetery, and we sometimes jokingly comment that perhaps the doctors there weren't quite up to scratch, which is totally unfair, of course. So what I'm intending to do, obviously, is to deal with issues related to death, inevitably. I'll try not to make it a sermon, for which I'm poorly qualified, but what I'm going to do is give you some of my thoughts, my ideas, and maybe some advice. Not very much of what I say is going to be original, and perhaps I should say at this stage, as they do now on the television, that there's a warning that some of the stuff may be confronting and there may be use of blunt language. So, getting straight into it, if we're talking about the journey towards death or towards the end, the first step, in my opinion, is the acceptance of the fact that you are ultimately going to die. And it's an easy thing to say, but not necessarily an easy thing to do. I'll perhaps now talk about issues that relate to our society and our generation. We are in a way now shielded from death because we live in an affluent society. Looking around the room, I think I'm reasonable in saying that we're probably baby boomers or in that vintage. We are the first generation that were more than likely born in a hospital and will die in a hospital or an institution. Our parents had a different view of the world, had to contend with global conflicts and things that we've by and large managed to avoid. So we're now in a situation where people have a tendency to avoid thinking about death. And in a way that's protective, but it also leaves us vulnerable. We see on television or go to the films death portrayed sometimes in fairly graphic detail, but if you have knowledge you can see that it's not accurate in most occasions. On the other hand, when people show footage on the news of death and so forth, it's usually blurred, which is curious. It's to protect our sensibilities. So we have this issue that people can avoid and perhaps deny. We're in denial about it. It's something that happens to somebody else. I'll move now. I'll put my doctor's hat back on and describe the situation to you. You're a doctor, as I was, perhaps dealing with someone with serious malignant disease, and you have to break bad news to people. And they come into the room, often with family members. You look at them and on their face you can see they're seeking hope. They're seeking hope. And as a medical person, you have to make a decision, a difficult decision. Do you offer them hope? Do you offer them hope that's false hope? Or do you offer them the truth and reality? And my opinion is that you offer them the truth and reality. And there are reasons for that. So what I'm going to suggest, one of the first things is to adopt truth and reality, perhaps versus hope and wishful thinking. And you might wonder about that, but I think it's something that you need to consider. The value of acceptance of death will often help in this sort of situation. If you've perhaps contemplated death and accepted the fact that you're ultimately going to die, you will handle this situation much better than somebody that has perhaps lived with denial, and those people will often react with, well, apart from denial, they'll move on to anger, anxiety, depression, and then ultimately you hope that they will reach a point of acceptance. There are advantages in accepting the reality that you're going to ultimately die. One of these is planning. When you die, it doesn't just affect you, it affects other people, and you have to acknowledge that. And therefore, there are things that we need to make sure we don't avoid, and that is things like making a will, perhaps an advanced life directive, maybe financial considerations with regard to other members of your family, succession planning, maybe a bucket list that we've already touched on earlier. So planning is one of the advantages if you can do that before you're placed in the situation where you're confronted with bad news. The other advantage is that it makes you focus on the fact that you have to use your remaining time, and the general advice that I would give would be that you make sure that you do things that are meaningful and worthwhile to you and enjoyable to you. But the reality is that our days are numbered. Our days are numbered. And we don't know what that number is. It might be 3,653, or it might be 1. That creates uncertainty. We don't know the future, and uncertainty can create worry and anxiety. On the other hand, uncertainty does protect us. Would you want to know the number? I think not. There are some signs, however, of the number getting smaller. They're fairly common sense, really. In our discussions at the table, if you're going to the doctors fairly frequently, or seeing medical profession and other health workers frequently, if people are wanting to operate on you, and so forth, or if you're being, what shall I say, propped up by artificial things like hearing aids, changes to glasses, walking sticks, walking frames, artificial joints, and pacemakers, etc. All right, that's a sign that the number's getting smaller. We have to live with that reality. So you reach a point in life where time is your most valuable asset. Time is a more valuable asset than other things such as money and possessions. Therefore, I think it's important that you do things that are meaningful and worthwhile. And you need to think about that and think about what you're doing. At the end of the day, I would recommend that you think, now what have I done today, and go over it. If I don't make it through the night, at least I've cleaned the gutters, I've watered the garden, and I've told my wife that I love her. You've done something worthwhile, okay? When you're lying in bed at night, can't get to sleep, instead of counting sheep, count up all the ways in which you've had good fortune in your life. And there will be plenty. And by the time you finish those, you'll probably be fallen off to sleep. Don't dwell on the past. We've all had misfortune, regrets. Things have gone wrong, we've made mistakes. That's in the past. You can't change the past, you can't control the past. There are some things in the future that you can control. There's a lot you can't, but there are some things in the future that you can control. So you need to focus on those and follow through. If you wake up in the morning, rejoice. I'd like to perhaps conclude this little bit with some words of wisdom written by somebody who had a fairly close association historically with this church, and his words were these: I expect that I will only travel or pass through this world but once. I therefore want to make sure that I show goodness and kindness to my fellow creatures, and not defer or avoid this, for I will not pass this way again. And that was the words of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, which resonate with me. We're going to change tack now, and I'm going to talk about something that might seem unrelated, and that's the human brain. The human brain is still largely understood. We're scratching the surface and finding out more. But the human brain has evolved to the point where we can have the ability, I should say, to learn a huge amount. We can have a almost limitless imagination and creativity. It has other aspects to it. It means that we're capable of believing almost anything and being made to believe almost anything. And there are lots of examples I could talk about. It's also left us with we're the only species, almost certainly the only species that can contemplate the fact that we're going to die. And we're left therefore with a situation where death becomes the subject of a lot of philosophy, religion, literature and poetry. We therefore have an issue with worry and anxiety about death. Now, there are a couple of aspects to this. One is that we're really hardwired, our brains are hardwired to try and stay alive as long as we can. And I don't think there's much that can be done to avoid that. But so people worry about death because it represents the end of life. There is also another side issue, which is that some people are worried and anxious about death itself, that it's going to be particularly nasty experience. And I thought even though this may be a little bit confronting, we'll discuss that because I think we can offer you some reassurance in that area. In this room, my guess is that the vast majority will die in one of two ways, either a sudden death or a gradual death. The sudden death situation, say after a major heart attack or a major stroke, will very quickly, almost instantaneously, render the part of your brain that controls whether you're conscious or not, it will go. So there's absolutely no need to worry about sudden death. It is stressful for relatives, friends and bystanders, but from your point of view, I don't think there's anything to fear. The other group, perhaps a larger group, is those that will die, and this is not, I'm not covering every base here, but the vast majority of us here will probably have what is regarded as a gradual death, and we're talking about things like malignancy, cancer, or organ failure, or things like the frailty of old age. Gradual death is possibly something you've witnessed. I'll just talk a little bit about it, but the reality is that at a certain point you're unconscious, you're not aware. That can be several hours, even days before your heart stops or your lungs, or you stop breathing, okay? So it's really, the majority of people die as if they're under a general anaesthetic. And I hope that will be some reassurance to you. Now, we haven't covered every scenario, but I personally don't fear the death in the sense that it's going to be something horrible. There are, however, hardships that potentially arise on the journey towards the end. We'll perhaps just touch on a few of those. These, fortunately, will often come at a gradual rate that make life more tolerable, but we can expect that there is going to be physical impairments of various sorts, maybe immobility, various organs may fail, and associated with this there can be loss of dignity, there can be embarrassment even, sometimes that we have to deal with, surgical procedures, medical treatments with worrying side effects, and then we move on to some of those that are more difficult to contemplate, and they include loss of brain function, which is a reality, and the other things that we have to deal with in this period sometimes are death of loved ones and the grief that comes with that. Grief is a normal reaction to loss in this sort of situation, but I would make this point that grief shouldn't be allowed to continue indefinitely, because you owe it to yourself and the loved one to carry on at a certain point. So I'll just make that caution about grief. And to deal with all of these hardships, we have to draw on things such as resilience. We have to be adaptable to change, and we need courage. and a sense of humour. And at the end of the day, sometimes the only alternative is simply to accept the situation. Now, I've seen all of these in people that have had to deal with this, and I aspire to do the same myself, if I can. Remember that at this time there's an opportunity for you to set an example to other people and to inspire people. So, just to summarise the important ingredients on this journey towards the end. Firstly, acceptance of reality, and to help do this, it is worth doing things that people might try and avoid, like contemplating your own death, and, more difficult, contemplating the death of loved ones. Avoid over-reliance on hope and wishful thinking and fantasy. Planning, we've talked about. Use courage, if you can find it, to defeat fear and despondency. And you have to summon up resilience to counteract hardship. Use your time in a meaningful way. Don't waste time. Don't just drift. Put your oar in the water with purpose. And that leads me to the conclusion, which I'm going to use, for which I'm going to use a poem by Tennyson called Ulysses. And it's about an ancient Greek hero who's reaching the end of his life. And he says to his crew, he addresses his crew, "You and I are old. Old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all. But something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." So I'll conclude that now and invite discussion or questions of anything, which I hope I can manage to answer.
Thank you, John. Right, questions. There's a roving Mike and a roving Peter with the roving Mike.
Didn't mention suicide.
Right.
Thank you for your presentation. One word that I did not hear was the word pain. Many people are frightened of the fact that when they are dying, it could be a long and painful ordeal.
Yes.
And as a consequence, as my friend at the back said, sometimes they deliberately end their life early through suicide to avoid that.
Okay, well, I sort of anticipated this. I didn't want to put it into the main text, but what you're perhaps talking about is the issue of suicide, euthanasia, palliative care, all of these things, and that's a good issue to raise. Suicide was a bit of a difficult topic in the sense that suicide is been an issue affecting the law and religion for some time. For example, people that committed suicide were deemed to have committed a sin. I think I'm right in saying that. I think that's no longer the case, well, it is no longer the case, but it's had a difficult place. Now, the issue of pain is a real one, particularly in certain malignant disease and a few others. To combat that, we have had the use of strong narcotic drugs and so forth that can probably control the majority of them reasonably well, but not everybody. Okay, and now society is looking at the issue of euthanasia. Euthanasia, eu means well, thanatos is death, a good death. And it is a difficult subject. In my case, when I was a medical student, I took the Hippocratic Oath, part of which said, thou shalt not kill. And there were good reasons for having that there. That oath is no longer taken as a routine. It's something slightly different, but the sentiments were still the same. So it is a difficult one to know what to say, but I think if we look at example, we have a pet dog and it's suffering. We have no great qualms about taking them to the vet to have them put to sleep to save the suffering. And I think common sense suggests that in certain circumstances, and these are overall not common, but there are some circumstances where I think it's a humane thing to do to shorten people's life. But it's not a simple issue because it has to involve the law, it has to involve politics, and rules have to be put in place. I philosophically have no great difficulty with the concept of voluntary assisted dying, but it is a difficult issue for society to have to confront, and politicians. And I think it will become a routine. But my experience is that the majority of people's pain and issues like that can be controlled with good palliative care. And I think it's perhaps a comfort, though, for these people to know that at some point, if they can't cope with the situation, that there's something else that can be offered. A warning from my sister-in-law, who's a registered nurse, who comes from Victoria, that we've just been talking to, that the voluntary assisted dying is not a simple matter. You have to make an appointment to see a panel, and that can take 6 months. So it's not a simple matter to deal with. But philosophically, I think there's it's a way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just. Yeah, I guess in relating to that, I've worked as a nurse in both hospice and intensive care, where I thought pain management was generally very well done. But outside of those specialist settings, it seemed to me that staff were more afraid of analgesia than the patients were afraid of pain.
Yes.
I think it's a sort of a political health management problem.
Yes.
that the specialist services needed don't deal with it. Now, I haven't come across an instance where pain management was not possible, given the will of the staff to address the issue. Do you have any thoughts on?
Yes, I think one of the issues is I think good palliative care done with the aim of not trying to conserve life but to relieve symptoms is certainly a good option in most cases. But it's a difficult area because it's relatively new. I mean, for example, when I retired, there was the point I retired, which was some years ago. Euthanasia was discussed, but not. There wasn't any. I have no personal experience with it. No, well, it's a number of years. There were people advocating for euthanasia.
I know it was happening as far back as 1986, my first encounter.
All right. Yes, I mean, but the history of it is that one of the territory, the Northern Territory, proposed it. And it was disallowed by the federal government, and so we've now. It's relatively recent that the legislation has been passed to allow voluntary assisted dying.
Some years ago, my former or ex-sister-in-law, pancreatic cancer. She knew that it was the end.
Yes.
She'd had it a number of years.
Yes.
She ended up not only having to refuse treatment, but she refused food and water, and it took her weeks to die.
Yes. No, I've
my
seen...
My mother also suicided. My father attempted it twice. So.
Yes. Yes, no, I accept what you say, and I've seen these things. I've seen people with pancreatic cancer, and they have a miserable life, and you can only offer them the best analgesia you can. Now we've got the prospect, if people are willing or wanting this, if they can jump through all the bureaucratic hoops, then they can have... the pancreatic cancer would be a good example of where you could use euthanasia with good effect. Yes, no, I understand the situation, but you know, society is having to shift its thinking in this area.
Yes, look, I'm puzzled by all this stuff. I come from a northern European country where we're very practical about things like this, always have been. We've had ZPG, for example, for as long as I can remember. And I think it's my life. Nobody else's business to end my life. I had no say in how I came here, and I'm certainly going to have a damn lot of say about how I go. And if I want to go, for whatever reason, and it doesn't need to be physical reason or physical infirmity, it may be mentally that you can't cope. I'm getting to the age where I find it hard to cope with living. Everything is an effort. You're tottering around. Oh, how am I going to make my bed? What about dinner? It's just getting hard to live. And if I want to go, I've had enough, I want to go. And so I know how to do it. I joined Dr. Philip Nitschke's group, Deaths with Dignity. I've also always been a member of the SAVES. When we came down from Darwin, one of our best friends was diagnosed with astrocytoma, and we saw her dying, and she'd always been a wonderful lady, dignified, and she was so in a terrible way. I felt pity for her. So we joined SAVES first of all, when it was in its early stages, and now I'm a member of Dr. Philip Nitschke's Deaths with Dignity. I know what to do. We've had meeting. I am still trying to find a bottle of Nembutal. That's the difficult part.
Well,
but
this is one of the. There are practical difficulties in this situation. I've got no great philosophical argument with I personally haven't got... the difficulties arise when you need assistance from somebody else. But I think that's now... Yeah, I think we've...
But they could be co-accused of this.
The difficulties are that they have rules, and I'm afraid getting someone else to assist you to die because of depression or unhappiness is not going to be easy at this stage.
So you have to do it yourself.
Well, I guess if you like to put it that way, yes. It's, I think, restricted in most states to people that have been diagnosed with a terminal illness and requesting, perhaps because of severe pain or other issues, but yeah, there are practical issues that involve having to go before a panel and arranging a time. It's one of those difficult subjects, and I'm sorry I can't give you any black or white answers. Indeed. Yes, indeed. I can't argue with that.
John, to take that lady's proposal further, what are some of the legal or familial aspects if someone does take their life like that on their family, their estate, all of those sorts of things?
I don't think there are any existing problems. There used to be in the past insurance issues. You couldn't sort of take out a life insurance policy and then expect to collect after you've thing. But that's the only thing I'm aware. It's no longer on the statute books as being a crime, attempted suicide. Obviously, if you're successful, there's little point in pursuing it. But yes, attempted suicide was really, or suicide was more an issue of, perhaps, forgive me saying it, religious sensibilities in the past. For example, someone that had suicided couldn't be buried in the town cemetery. They had to go out. See? But I think that's a very distant past thing.
I could probably answer that because my mother suicided in 1970,
yes.
And she's buried in a church yard in South Australia with the minister.
Yes.
My father attempted suicide twice, 10 years before that when I was 11.
Yes.
There was no legal repercussions.
No, that's. I think that's as it should be. Yeah, I agree.
Just to add a little bit of information about I come from 15 years of lecturing in financial planning, and in that space we talk about the impact of suicide on your life insurance. It's a 13-month wait, basically.
Thank you.
So, no, that's okay. That's in the current situation.
Yes.
I think I had 220 clients who were in this age group, give or take. I think the biggest thing about suicide that they raised was, what if I'm not entirely successful? I'm only partially successful. And I think that's the greatest tragedy that seems to arise, that people don't actually have the full capacity. And as much as it seems easy, with all due respect, I think it's probably not as easy as it seems on the day. I think that, well, now I'll just, a quick case study that I'm aware of. Dan Lacroix is a friend of mine. He's one of Canada's greatest skiers. I spoke to him 4 months ago, and I said, "How's Doc?" And Doc was a dentist who raised Dan and his 4 sons as his own children, even though Dan's father had died. He said, "Doc's gone." And I said, "Oh, gee, what happened there?" He said, "Oh, we had a nice dinner and then someone came in and Doc went down to the back room and they administered him an injection, and that was it for Doc." And they knew that Doc had made that decision 12 months earlier. Doc had made, a little bit like our to-do lists. I don't know if this is still working, but a little bit like our to-do lists, Doc had made a dinner party with his friends and with his family. He spent the consequent 12 months after he got approval to have assisted dying, essentially, like you say, ticking off some kind of a bucket list. I'm not entirely certain, but if anybody wants to know, I'm happy to reach out to Dan and find out what was wrong with Doc. But what I understood was that Doc had felt that he'd reached his late 80s and he'd had no great suffering, and he felt that any suffering that he was going to experience was going to be experienced by his children and their children, and he didn't want to be around to see that. And that was essentially Doc's rationale, as I understand it. But I can get further clarity on that. So yeah, I guess I'd encourage people to take the well-worn path, and if you're thinking about the idea of taking your own life, then get all of the psychological, medical, political, legal, etc. assistance that you can, because they're all there. The presence of assisted dying means that those support services are in place. So not that I have had any experience in Australia, but that's my feedback.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yes, well, I'm standing here as somebody that didn't sort of participate in this area, so I apologise for my lack of knowledge and ignorance, but it is certainly a changing, society's changing in this area, and there is quite a lot of community support for people in this situation. There's also some opposition to it, and so for politicians it's difficult, I think, but there is sort of a progressive movement that's pushing it, but there's also resistance.
And I just want to say one other thing. Like Penny, I've had, I think, 9 friends take their own lives. I'm just under 60 years old. I cannot imagine, unless I lived completely on my own, that, well, I'll say it a different way. I'm aware that everybody who's been involved in taking that person down from the rafters or finding them in their bedroom or whatever has had a diminished life after that.
Yes.
And I'm exceptionally aware that my friend Dan, who got to speak to Doc about his decision to take his own life, is at a far better level of wellness for the rest of his life, given that Doc took the responsibility of actually talking to him prior to the taking of his own life. So if anybody's thinking about that, I'd ask them to reach out and make sure that the people closest to them are aware of their needs.
Yes, I mean, it just reinforces the fact that your death is not just your business, it affects other people. But I acknowledge the fact that death can sometimes be your friend.
Sorry, Mark and then Don.
So if that's the case, what are your top 3 tips for the person left behind? What do you do after, particularly after a sudden death, when you're not expecting to have confront the situation? What are the things that you do for yourself to manage the death of a loved one?
Well, I think the first thing you do is give yourself a chance to grieve. Grief is sort of something that seems to be cleansing in a sense. But as I tried to indicate, there are reasons for not allowing it to sort of continue on indefinitely, mainly for your own self-interest, and also there's no doubt that the person that's died probably wouldn't want you to have to interrupt your life forever to get on with things, I think is the answer, and you'll need often help and support to do that. You have to develop, perhaps new interests. I didn't talk about, when we were talking about planning, something you can consider is what I call cross-training. And I'm not talking about physical exercise or activity, but of course that's still a good thing to be involved in. But often if you're in a partnership relationship with somebody, you'll find that people tend to specialise and do certain things in a partnership, and that works very efficiently until someone's not there, and then you can be left in a difficult situation, just practical things like not being able to cook or not being able to use a computer. I'm talking about myself now. So I think it is a good idea if you're in a partnership where one person does X, Y and Z and you do something else, that you teach each other some skills. Because you see people flounder in this sort of situation if they don't do that sort of planning. And it's also people that just deny about the reality of death, then find themselves confronted with bad news, like I was saying, and they have to scramble to get this done, that done, tick all the boxes, get your life organised, as it were, when they could be doing something more meaningful. They might have some months where they can do something that they actually enjoy or do things. So, don't forget the cross-training. I think that's something to consider if it applies to you.
I was just going to make a comment. John, you referred to it very briefly during your talk, and that is the Advanced Care Directive.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the issues we're talking about here tonight can be very well addressed by doing an Advanced Care Directive. So making your wishes known and actually recording them, but more importantly, making sure that your whole family is involved.
Yes.
So that you're not, you're taking the journey with your family so that they know what you want. And so a lot of the issues that are caused by a sudden death are avoided by bringing them up and discussing them before the death occurs. The only other comment I would make is that I've been heavily involved in palliative care for years, and in most instances symptoms can be very well controlled, and particularly in the home where the patient and the family have control of the medication. So I think most people can be reassured in that area, but that's just my comments.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything.
May I just make a comment that's very pertinent, because I just made an Advanced Care Directive. My youngest son got it off the internet. We filled it in. My doctor signed it. Jeremy has a copy. I sent one over to my other son. And my brother will have a copy. My doctor has a copy. And it's just so easy to do. It only takes a few minutes of your time, make sure your doctor understands and he knows about it. And yes, do. I strongly advise people to get an Advanced Care Directive.
Yes, I did mention Advanced Care Directive, didn't go into detail, but I think it can save your family a lot of worry if you can find out about it. If you're not sure about it, often a lawyer or a financial planner and all this thing can help you arrange these sort of things. Yeah.
John, earlier you were talking about our brains.
Yes.
When my mum was dying, and we sort of knew that she was in hospital, and she was 94, so had a good life. But she was unconscious for several hours.
Yes.
My question is, but still breathing, so obviously
yes,
the body was still functioning. Is that a time, do we know anything about that time? As, for instance, if I put on Mum's favourite song, or if I didn't know Mum's favourite song and put on a song that she hated, would she get upset about it? I don't know. Do we know anything about that situation?
Well, my strong opinion is, and it's of course impossible to prove this, but my strong opinion is that when people lapse into unconsciousness on the way to death, they're not aware. I have to say that. I don't believe, and people will often be encouraged to go in and perhaps hold mother's hand, perhaps in the belief that it's somehow comforting the patient. I have to confess I don't believe that. You see, while we're talking about this subject, there isn't a lot of encouragement by nursing staff sometimes to go and sit, with the dying person, and I think that's fine, but it can be a little bit worrying sometimes, because as you die, your breathing becomes irregular. It looks as if they're struggling and straining, and it can be a cause of anxiety for the sort of inexperienced observer. In my strong opinion, which I got no real proof, but I'm fairly certain that they're not aware of anything. They're deeply unconscious. As I said, it's like being under a general anaesthetic. One of the pieces of evidence is that people that die, in inverted commas, and are resuscitated, they have no recollection of anything, for what it's worth. Yeah.
John, I'd just like to make a comment about whether they know what's going on or not. My mother at 96 had a severe stroke, and the first day she obviously knew what was happening around her and managed to sort of say, why me? And my brother and I were we were there all day. We didn't stay at night with her, but there all day. And we were preparing her funeral. And Mum appeared that she went on for 11 days with no food or fluids or anything. But she was still very aware that we were there, although she appeared to be unconscious. And every little while my brother would read out what he had prepared for her eulogy, and every little while Mum would react. It became a farcical situation, because every time she reacted, my brother would hop up and run around to her and say, "Is that okay, Mum?" And she couldn't respond at all, apart from the fact that she showed us that she had heard. So from what appeared to be an unconscious state, she was still hearing what we were saying.
Well, I know that's the belief of some people.
Well, we saw it in action.
Okay, all right.
John, I think in the question time, as much as in the presence, you've drawn us out, and obviously we've all had experiences to which we relate, and the number of questions that came reflected that. So thank you, and thank you for taking us on a journey and encouraging us to be sometimes different people afterwards, like Ulysses. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. And
I dedicated that to Bonnie and Bruce.
Well done. So thank you so much. And it was very courageous of you to do that with two other doctors present. And to make some old connections. So we were very grateful for that. Proteus was the Greek god who appeared in many different forms, hence the protea. And you've suggested that we ought to be prepared to operate in different ways after a death. So we have a card with Pratia and something else to encourage you to maybe change your own shape a little.
Thank you, Malcolm. That is the last journeying for this year. Tomorrow we'll be doing some planning about next year. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. But that's tomorrow. And if you want to help with what happened tonight, there's a bowl on the way. You can't come to a church without knowing there'd be a bowl somewhere. So thank you and have a good Christmas.